The kid flicked it open and closed 3 times like he was fidgeting with a toy at a doctor's office. Click, snap, click, snap, click, snap. "Yeah, it's a Zippo," he said. "We sell these for like $8. Howard Meeks stood on the other side of the counter. 79 years old, reading glasses on a chain around his neck, a green John Deere cap he'd been wearing so long it had a permanent sweat stain above the brim, and watched a 23-year-old kid flick his father's lighter open and closed like it was a fidget spinner. "That was my father's," Howard said. "Oh, for sure," the kid said, not looking up. He turned the lighter over, glanced at the bottom, set it down on the glass with a click. "Look, I'll be real with you. Zippos are everywhere. Every garage sale, every estate sale, every junk drawer in America. I've got a whole bin of them in the back. I could do maybe $10, 15 if it still lights." $15 for the lighter his father carried through Korea, for the lighter that still had mud from the Chosin Reservoir in the hinge, for the only thing Staff Sergeant Arthur Meeks brought home from the war besides a Purple Heart and a silence that lasted 40 years. Let me tell you about Howard Meeks and his father's Zippo. Howard was born in 1946 in Terre Haute, Indiana. His father, Arthur, had just come home from the Pacific. He'd been in the Navy during the last year of World War II, mostly on a supply ship in the Philippines. Arthur came home in one piece, married Howard's mother, Barbara, got a job at the Pfizer chemical plant on the south side of Terre Haute, and settled into the kind of life that men settled into in 1946. Work, church, kids, a house with a mortgage, and not a lot of conversation about what happened overseas. But Korea was different. Arthur re-enlisted in 1950 when the war broke out. Howard was 4 years old. He didn't understand why his father was leaving. Barbara told him Daddy had to go help some people far away, and he'd be back soon. Arthur shipped out in September 1950 with the 1st Marine Division. He was at Incheon. He was at Seoul. And in November and December of 1950, he was at the Chosin Reservoir, one of the most brutal battles in American military history. Temperatures dropped to -35. Men froze to death standing up. Weapons jammed. Vehicles wouldn't start. And 17,000 Americans against 120,000 Chinese soldiers in mountains so cold that plasma froze in the IV bags and morphine syringes had to be held in medics' mouths to thaw them. Arthur made it out. A lot of men didn't. He came home in March of 1951 with a Purple Heart, shrapnel in his left shoulder that he'd carry for the rest of his life, and a Zippo lighter in the breast pocket of his field jacket. He never talked about Korea, not once, not to Barbara, not to Howard, not to anyone. When Howard asked him once, at maybe 12 years old, "What was it like over there, Dad?" Arthur looked at him and said, "Cold." That was it. One word, cold. And the look on his father's face when he said it, Howard never asked again. But the Zippo was always there. Arthur carried it every day for the rest of his life. He didn't smoke. He'd quit cigarettes in 1955 after Barbara told him she wasn't raising 3 boys alone because he wanted to kill himself one lucky strike at a time. But he kept the lighter. He flicked it open every morning at the kitchen table while he drank his coffee. Just opened it, lit it, watched the flame for a second or two, closed it. Every morning. Howard grew up with that sound, the click and the snap and the hiss of the flame, the way other kids grew up with a radio or a screen door slamming. Every morning, 6 o'clock. Arthur in his work clothes, steel thermos of coffee, the newspaper folded to the sports page, and the lighter. Click, snap, watch the flame, close it, drink the coffee, go to work. 37 years of that, 6 days a week. Howard could set his watch by it. The lighter went everywhere Arthur went. Oh, in his left breast pocket. Always. Shirt pocket in summer. Jacket pocket in winter. When he sat down, he'd pat the pocket once, the way you pat your wallet to make sure it's there. Howard asked him once why he kept carrying it since he'd quit smoking. Arthur looked at him and said, "Keeps my hands busy." That wasn't the reason. Howard knew it wasn't the reason, but he was old enough by then to know that some men have their own reasons for things, and those reasons aren't yours to ask about. The lighter itself was a standard Zippo, brushed chrome, rectangular, about the size of a matchbox. But it wasn't standard. On the front, someone, Arthur, probably, though he never confirmed it, had scratched an engraving into the case with a knife or a nail or whatever was available. It read, "Chosen Few, December 1950. Below that, in 4 sets of initials, AM, RK, JD, PS, Arthur's initials, and 3 others. Howard never found out who RK, JD, and PS were. He asked once. Arthur shook his head. Not a no. More like a please don't. On the bottom of the lighter, stamped into the metal by the factory, were markings that Howard had never paid attention to. He figured they were just manufacturing codes. Every Zippo has them. He'd seen the lighter 10,000 times and never once turned it over and thought about what those markings meant. Arthur passed away in 1992. Lung cancer. The shrapnel in his shoulder had nothing to do with it, but 40 years of working in a chemical plant probably did. He was 66. He died at Union Hospital in Terre Haute on a Wednesday afternoon in November. Howard was in the room. Barbara was in the room. Arthur Jr. and David were in the hallway. Michael was on a plane from California that wouldn't land for another 2 hours. Arthur's breathing had been getting shallower all morning. The nurse said it wouldn't be long. Howard sat on one side, Barbara on the other. Barbara was holding Arthur's left hand. His right hand was closed around something on the bed, closed tight, the way you hold something when you're afraid someone will take it. When it was over, when the machine made that sound, and the nurse came in and Barbara made a noise that Howard would hear in his sleep for the rest of his life, Howard gently opened his father's right hand. The Zippo was there, warm from Arthur's palm, the last warmth his father ever made. Howard put the lighter in his pocket and didn't tell anyone about it until the funeral was over. Howard put the lighter in his pocket and carried it home. He didn't carry it every day the way Arthur did. Howard wasn't a carrier of things, wasn't a fidgeter, wasn't the kind of man who needed something in his hands. But he kept it in the top drawer of his nightstand, and every now and then, maybe once a month, maybe less, he'd take it out and flick it open and listen to the sound. Click, snap. The sound of his father's kitchen, the sound of 6 o'clock in the morning in Terre Haute, Indiana. Now Howard was 79, and the money situation was simple math that didn't add up. His wife, Ruth, was in a memory care facility, Meadow Springs, on the east side of Terre Haute. Early onset Alzheimer's. She'd been there for 3 years. She was 76. She didn't know Howard's name anymore, but she smiled when he held her hand. And that was enough for him to drive out there every single day, 7 days a week, rain or shine or ice on the roads. Howard went to see Ruth every day at 2 o'clock. He brought her a vanilla milkshake from McDonald's because that was the one thing she still got excited about. Her face would light up when she saw the cup, and she'd reach for it with both hands like a child. Some days she'd say his name. Most days she wouldn't. Some days she'd call him Arthur, his father's name. Which was worse than not being recognized at all, because it meant she was somewhere in 1972 in her head in the kitchen on 8th Street, and the man sitting next to her wasn't her husband, but her father-in-law. And Howard had to sit there and smile and be Arthur for an hour because correcting her made her cry. The problem was the cost. The Medicare covered some of it. Medicaid covered some more. But there was a gap. There's always a gap. And that gap was $485 a month. Howard's pension from Pfizer, where he'd worked for 36 years following in his father's footsteps, was $1,720 a month. Social Security was $1,540. After the mortgage on the house on 8th Street, $520, which should have been paid off years ago, but they'd taken a home equity line in 2011 when Ruth first got diagnosed, and they were still paying for the doctors and the tests and the second opinions that all said the same thing. After the mortgage, insurance, utilities, groceries, gas, prescriptions, and the $485 gap at Meadow Springs, Howard had about $45 left over each month. sometimes less. In January, the gap payment and the heating bill hit in the same week, and Howard had to choose. He paid Meadow Springs. He kept the thermostat at 62 and wore his coat inside for a week. He had 3 sons, Arthur Jr., David, and Michael. Arthur Jr. was a plumber in Indianapolis, doing okay, but not great. David was a teacher in Evansville, a teacher's salary, 2 kids, a wife who worked part-time at a daycare. Michael was in California somewhere, San Jose or San Francisco. Howard could never keep it straight, doing something with computers that paid well, but Michael had a lifestyle that ate money the way a furnace eats gas. None of them were in a position to help. And even if they were, Howard wouldn't ask. He'd watched his own father work double shifts at Pfizer to pay for Howard's braces. He'd watched Barbara cut the mold off bread and toast, what was left, because the next payday was Thursday, and it was Tuesday. You don't come from that and then call your kids for money, you just don't. The worst part wasn't the math. The worst part was the fear. The fear that one month he wouldn't make the gap payment and Meadow Springs would send a letter and he'd have to move Ruth somewhere cheaper, somewhere worse, somewhere she wouldn't get the vanilla milkshake at 2 o'clock because nobody would know to bring it. That fear sat on his chest every night like a cat that wouldn't move. He'd rather eat soup from a can and wear his coat inside than call his sons and say, "I can't cover your mother's care." Howard's neighbor, a retired electrician named Pete Dunbar, came over one Saturday to help fix a dripping faucet. Pete was 74, a widower himself, the kind of neighbor who noticed things like dripping faucets and didn't wait to be asked. While they were under the sink, Pete said, "Howard, you look tired." Howard said he was fine. Pete said, "You're not fine. I can see it." And Howard, because he was under a sink and not looking at anyone's face, which made it easier, told Pete about the gap payment and the heating bill and the coat inside the house. Pete suggested the pawn shop. Howard thought about what he had that was worth selling. The house was mortgaged. The car was a 2007 Chevy Malibu with a cracked windshield and 167,000 miles. The furniture was the same furniture they'd bought at Sears in 1984. The only thing Howard owned that might be worth anything was the Zippo. And even that, he figured, was probably worth $20, maybe $30 to a collector. But $30 was $30, and $30 plus whatever else he could scrape together might cover next month's gap. He drove to Second Chance Pawn on Wabash Avenue. The kid behind the counter was named Tyler Marsh, 23. Buzz cut, a thin gold chain, a black polo shirt with the shop logo, cargo pants, Jordans. He'd worked there for 8 months. He was on his phone when Howard walked in, watching a highlight reel of something, the tiny sound of a crowd cheering leaking from the speaker. Howard set the Zippo on the counter. Tyler flicked it open and closed 3 times. Click, snap, click, snap, click, snap. Then offered $15 and said he had a whole bin of them in the back. Howard looked at the lighter on the counter, his father's lighter. The scratched engraving, Chosen Few, December 1950, the 4 sets of initials. The mud still in the hinge that Howard had never cleaned out because he wasn't sure it was mud, and he wasn't sure he wanted to know what else it might be. $15. He reached for it. Nobody in that shop knew what Howard was really holding. Subscribe to Hidden Worth. You don't want to miss this. That's when the back door opened and a man in a corduroy blazer walked in, carrying a cardboard box of appraisal tags. His name was Donald Pratt, 61 years old, thin, precise, wire-rimmed glasses, a neatly trimmed gray beard. He wore a brown corduroy blazer over a plaid button-down, khaki pants, brown leather shoes that had been resoled twice. He looked like a high school history teacher, which is what he'd been for 15 years before becoming a full-time militaria appraiser and authenticator. Donald worked with Heritage Auctions, the American Military Historical Society, and private collectors across the country. He specialized in wartime personal items, trench art, field-modified equipment, personal effects with documented provenance. Second Chance Pawn's owner had him come in once a month to tag military items for the shop's online listings. Donald set his box on the counter. He saw the Zippo. He saw the scratched engraving. He stopped. "May I?" he asked Howard. Howard nodded. Donald picked up the lighter with both hands. He didn't flick it. He didn't snap it. He held it close to his glasses and read the engraving. Chosen Few, December 1950, AM, RK, JD, PS. He turned it over. He looked at the bottom, the factory stamps that Howard had never paid attention to. He took a small magnifying glass from his blazer pocket and examined the stamps closely. "Where did you get this?" he asked. His voice had changed, quieter, the way people talk when they realize they're holding something that matters. "My father's. Staff Sergeant Arthur Meeks, 1st Marine Division. He was at the Chosin Reservoir." Donald set the lighter on the counter very carefully. He took off his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt. He put them back on. "The factory stamps on the bottom of this lighter indicate it was manufactured in 1950, the second quarter, based on the date code. That's consistent with your father's timeline, but that's not what makes this significant." He pointed to the engraving. "No field-engraved Zippos from the Korean War are a recognized category of military collectible. Soldiers scratched unit designations, battle names, dates, and personal messages into their lighters as a form of trench art. Most of the surviving examples are from rear echelon units or from later in the war, 1951, 1952, 1953. Zippos specifically engraved with Chosin or Frozen Chosin or Chosen Few from the actual battle period, November and December 1950, are extraordinarily rare. Most of the men who were at Chosin didn't bring anything back. Many of them didn't come back at all." He pointed to the initials. "The 4 sets of initials suggest this lighter was engraved as a group memento, 4 men marking their survival. If those initials can be matched to service records from the 1st Marine Division at Chosin, the provenance becomes exceptionally strong." Tyler had stopped flicking things. He was standing very still. "Mr. Meeks, a field-engraved Zippo with a confirmed Chosin Reservoir provenance matched to a specific Marine with documentation. At auction through Heritage or a specialized militaria house, you would be looking at $35,000 to $50,000. He paused. $43,000 is a reasonable midpoint. $43,000. The shop was quiet. The highlight reel on Tyler's phone had ended. The only sound was the hum of the overhead lights. Tyler was looking at the lighter on the counter. The same lighter he'd flicked open and closed like a toy. The same lighter he'd offered $15 for. The same lighter he said he had a whole bin of in the back. $15. For a Chosin Reservoir Zippo. And for a piece of one of the most savage battles in American history, scratched by a man who survived it and carried it every day until he died holding it. Howard didn't move. He was looking at the lighter and thinking about his father at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning. Click, snap, the flame, the coffee, the silence. 40 years of silence about what happened on that mountain. 40 years of flicking a lighter every morning and saying nothing. $43,000, Howard said, quietly, the way you say a prayer. He looked at the lighter, a 3-inch rectangle of brushed chrome with scratched letters on it. $43,000. He could pay the Meadow Springs gap for 7 years. He could pay off the home equity line. He could stop wearing his coat inside in January. He could stop choosing between the heating bill and his wife's care. All because his father, a 20-year-old kid from Terre Haute, scratched 4 sets of initials into a lighter on a frozen mountain in 1950 and carried it in his breast pocket for the next 42 years. "I'd recommend Heritage Auctions," Donald said. "They have a dedicated militaria department. If you have your father's service records, his Purple Heart documentation, anything that confirms his unit and deployment dates that strengthens the provenance significantly. I can make the introduction." He handed Howard his card. "Mr. Meeks, your father carried something through one of the worst battles in American military history and brought it home. The fact that it survived, that he survived, and that this lighter ended up here with the original engraving intact is remarkable. Tyler opened his mouth. Sir, I didn't know it was. If you want, I could talk to the owner and. Howard looked at him. Not angry, not satisfied. Just the look of a man who's watched his father's lighter get flicked open and closed by someone who didn't understand that every click was a man remembering something terrible. Son, Howard said, my father held that lighter when he died. It was the last thing in his hand, and you played with it like a cigarette trick. Tyler didn't have anything to say to that. Howard picked up the lighter. He didn't flick it. He closed his hand around it, the way Arthur's hand had been closed around it on that hospital bed, and put it in his jacket pocket. He nodded to Donald. He walked out. Let me tell you what happened. Howard called Donald Pratt that week. Donald came to the house on 8th Street and spent an afternoon documenting the lighter. Howard found Arthur's service records in a filing cabinet in the basement, his DD-214 discharge papers, the Purple Heart citation, a unit photograph from 1950 showing Arthur and 3 other Marines in cold weather gear. Howard looked at the photograph and pointed to the 3 men standing next to his father. RK, JD, PS, he said. Donald photographed everything. The lighter was consigned to Heritage Auctions' militaria sale. The catalog entry included Arthur's service photograph, the unit history, the Purple Heart citation, and a page-long essay about the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. The pre-sale estimate, $35,000 to $55,000. The winning bidder was the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia. They wanted it for their Korean War exhibit, not in a drawer, not in a case in someone's den, but in a museum where every Marine who walked through the door would see it. The lighter sold for $46,500. After commission, Howard received just over $37,800. He paid the Meadow Springs Gap 6 months in advance, $2,910. He paid off the home equity line, $8,200. He had the cracked windshield on the Malibu replaced, $340. He put $10,000 into a savings account he hadn't used in years. He sent each of his 3 sons $3,000 with a note. From your grandfather Arthur, he wanted you to have this. That wasn't true. Arthur never said any such thing. But Howard figured Arthur would have wanted it if he'd known, and sometimes that's close enough. He went to see Ruth the day the check cleared. He sat with her in the common room at Meadow Springs and held her hand for 2 hours. She didn't know his name. She didn't know about the lighter or the money or any of it, but she smiled when he held her hand. Howard visits Ruth every day. He drives the Malibu with the new windshield, and he doesn't worry about the gap payment anymore. The house on 8th Street is quiet in the mornings. No click, no snap, no flame at the kitchen table. The lighter is in Virginia now, in a glass case, under museum lighting, next to a placard that reads, Zippo lighter, field engraved Staff SGT. Arthur R. Meeks, USMC 1st Marine Division, Chosin Reservoir, December 1950, Chosin Few. Howard doesn't have the lighter anymore, but every morning when he sits at the kitchen table with his coffee, he flicks an imaginary lighter in his mind. Click, snap, and he sees the flame. He sees his father. He hears the silence, and he understands now what he didn't understand at 12 years old, that cold wasn't a description of the weather. It was everything Arthur could say about something that was too big for words. A kid in a pawn shop flicked it open and closed like a toy and said $15. He didn't know. They never do. If this story reminded you that worth isn't always obvious, subscribe to Hidden Worth. We have more stories like this one, and every single one of them will surprise you, because some things have hidden worth.